Hey, it's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the most common mix problems and how to fix them. I have a lot of experience in dealing with mix problems because I work as a mastering engineer. For those of you who don't know, I get a lot of mixes that don't have problems at all, and it's just like my whole job to make sure I don't destroy them and make them sound slightly better. But there's some sessions I get where, the mixes need a good deal of help. And often in those cases, the mixers are newer and they know that those mixes need a lot of help. And they often even ask for mix feedback, which I'm happy to give them as part of my role as a mastering engineer. I think it's one of the additional value adds of working with a mastering engineer who you like and trust. And I'll tell you that when there are problems in the mixes, there are a few things that come up again and again and again and again. And a lot of them actually stem from issues in people's monitoring environment. I think there's a lot of people who would mix even better if they could trust what they're hearing even better. But more on that in a minute. There are also some occasional missteps in judgment that'll happen. So I want to help you avoid these most common mix problems so that you can have more amazing sounding mixes right off the bat. And once you know what to listen for, you'll probably be able to correct these things before you get to the end of your mix. And you won't need a mastering engineer or some third-party critique to point these things out to you. So I hope this is useful for you. I even occasionally find these things cropping up in the work of, very good mixers. But by the time someone gets really very good, these are the problems that they're solving, that are separating these really good ones from everybody else who's just kind of okay and muddling through. All right, let's get into it. I don't want to give you much more further ado. The only thing I've got to do is the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors before I clue you into the most common mix problems and how to fix them. Big sponsor for this week is you. How do you sponsor? By hitting the like button if you're on the YouTube versions, making sure you subscribe to that notifications bell, and also check us out on the audio-only platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Make sure you subscribe there and consider giving us a rating and review on those platforms. It really does help. Also, big shout out to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days. You got to get the whole bundle if you haven't already. It's at least worth trying. Some crazy fun stuff in there, like the Decapitator, the Devil Lock, the Echo Boy. I could go on and on. Some of my favorite mixing plugins out there. So check them out, soundtoys.com. All right, let's get right into it. The most common mix problems and how to fix them, as told by your mastering engineer. All right, so the biggest problems, this should be obvious, that most people experience are in the low end. So let's just start there and get this out of the way first. The biggest problem in mixes that really aren't working well at all is that the mixer hasn't picked a lowest instrument. So they have like a kick drum and a bass instrument that are walking all over each other. I did a whole podcast episode about the best ways to fix your low end, and this is the tip that I saved for last in that episode because I think it's the best one when it comes to managing low end. You've always got to be thinking only one element in your mix can be the lowest one, right? You can't have two the lowest elements, right? Because that makes the whole idea of the lowest kind of meaningless. So you've got to figure out which should be the lowest. Which element? Is it the kick? Is it the bass that's going to primarily occupy that sub-frequency range? And sub-frequency range, let's call that 60 hertz and below. 60 hertz, 50 hertz, 40 hertz, only one element can be dominant there. If you try to have both your kick and your bass be dominant there, you're going to have a bad time. Generally speaking, the element that should be the lowest is going to be the less busy of those two elements. So if you have a kick drum that just hits once per measure on the downbeat and a fairly busy bass line that's doing this eighth notey kind of thing and it's got a lot of notes going on in it, chances are, in that context, the kick drum wants to have more sub energy, while the bass line is going to have more upper bass energy in, say, that 100 to 200 hertz range. Conversely, if you have like this really chill bass line that's just thudding away once or twice per measure, like on the downbeat, or you have like a synth bass that comes in just occasionally, so you have this really, not busy bass pattern, and there's this really kind of interesting, articulate, syncopated kick pattern on top of it, chances are the kick drum is going to be the less low of the two elements, and the bass wants to be the lower of the two elements in the mix. So maybe that bass has more of the energy below 60 hertz, below 80 hertz, and that kick has most of the energy between, say, 100 and 200. And you're making room for each of those. So you're thinking about that when you're doing your EQing. Which one should be higher? Which one should be lower? So that's number one, of having a plan about those things. The second biggest problem I find in mixes, and this is probably the second most common too, is having way too much low frequency energy or sometimes too little sub energy. And I think that this most often comes from just imperfect listening environments. And that's totally normal. And that's one of the reasons you get a mastering engineer to help with you with your mixes, because they're listening in a separate room, hopefully one that's better tuned, has better low-end response, hopefully on bigger, better speakers. Some high-end mastering engineers actually listen on high-end headphones these days, and some of those can help you listen really low. I would say something like 70 to 80% of the mixes I get are a little bit darker than they want to be in the final master. And in mastering, we'll brighten them up a little bit. And often part of that, in addition to maybe cutting some low mids, bringing out some air in the top end, finding an area in the upper mid-range that wants to be brought up, it might also include removing a little bit of sub-frequency content with some type of low-cut, high-pass filter, or reducing low-frequency content with some kind of gentle, low-shelving filter. That might be part of what happens in some of those darker mixes. Now, the other 20 or 30% or maybe slightly more of mixes that come in for mastering are too bright and want to be darkened. So that happens too. And I don't want to say that that's, I'm just going to make every single track brighter. Because when I was a mixer, I definitely worked with some mastering engineers. They tended to be slightly less expensive ones, who thought that everything should just get brighter, even when the mix was way too bright. And I told them, I feel like my mix is a little too bright. Can you make it darker? And it came back brighter. Now I'm ranting. Let me stop there and get back on track. Having PTSD flashbacks to mix and mastering sessions gone bad. Probably you can relate. So often enough, there will be a buildup of energy below 100 hertz, below 60 hertz that the mixer didn't know is there. So that's another common problem, way too much sub-frequency. And this will often show up among mixers who said, I tried to master this track myself, and when I got it, loud enough on the meters, it just sounds squished and bad and small. And if you start compressing and limiting something a lot to get it, loud and competitively loud, and it just sounds really bad when you do that, there's a good chance that there's way too much low frequency and or sub information in your mix. And that the kick and the bass and all that low frequency stuff is making those limiters and compressors clamp down, and they barely clamp down anything else except for your overactive sub and low frequency stuff. And this is compounded by the problem that, all things being equal, a brighter mixer master is going to sound louder than a darker mixer master. So when people are really frustrated about not being able to get to the level that they want, not being able to get cleanly and good sounding to the loudness of their favorite records, often the problem is some of this low frequency stuff that, a mastering engineer might help clean up. But that said, if you can make great decisions about that stuff in the mix, you're going to have an even better time. Next mix problem I want to get to is probably the most important thing. And that is people just not getting the basic balances right. And this is something that really separates great mixers from just okay ones. Getting the balances right. And so many new mixers, this was me too when I started mixing, focused too much on getting the bottom right, getting the top right, getting the sizzle right, playing around with effects, learning how to use a compressor when they're mixing, that they forget to do the most important part of mixing, the mixing part of mixing. And this is where you end up with a mix where the hi-hat is louder than the guitar solo. That's one that I like to bring up because it happens sometimes. And it should seem obvious that the guitar solo should be louder than the hi-hat, right? But this is something that people get wrong some of the time. Like, you got this screaming guitar solo coming in and literally the hi-hat is louder than it. That's a serious mix problem, and it's going to be a little bit distracting. And that's not the only thing that might happen. You might have these little kind of effecty things come in the sides, and maybe they're a little bit too screaming loud. Maybe they should be screaming loud. Maybe you have background vocals or some, hard pan acoustic guitars, and they want to come in loud, and they want to kind of steal the show. But you don't need to push their level that much for them to steal the show, because they're already interesting enough. So that's another thing to think about, is before you start messing around with compression, EQ, effects too much, spend a lot of time just doing your balances. And I know this sounds so obvious as to be, why did you throw this out there? Why do you even have to say that? It should be obvious. I say it because it's probably the next most common mixing issue of having just balances that aren't quite right. So that's number 3. Number 4 is overly apparent reverbs. Reverbs that take up way too much of the ear in the mix. And this can come from reverbs being too loud, too long, or too full bandwidth. And I did actually a full podcast episode about this as well. It's called The 2 Biggest Reverb Mistakes. And one of those biggest reverb mistakes is using a full bandwidth reverb, where all the high frequencies and all the low frequencies are represented. And if you actually listen to a lot of your favorite records, like amazing sounding commercial releases that you love, most of them don't actually use full bandwidth reverbs and delays. They will often either A, have some of the high frequency rolled off. That's very common. So you have a darker reverb where you don't have all the S's and T's and cymbals coming through the reverb too much. Or they might have a reverb or delay with a lot of low end rolled off, so it's not cluttering up the bottom. Or, this is also common, a band limited reverb where some of the high frequency is gone and some of the low frequency is gone. So the reverb is a little bit mid-rangey. And you can skew that to more upper mid-range, more lower mid-range, depending on what should be happening in the mix. But I would say the overly apparent reverb is our next most common mix mistake that you can fix. And one of the great ways to fix it is just by not using full bandwidth reverb, either by sending a band restricted send to your reverb or EQing the reverb returns, so you're not getting all the high highs and all the low lows in that reverb. And then also listening against references and really hearing how much reverb is appropriate in your genre, how much delay is appropriate in your genre, because sometimes those things can be more subtle than you realize. There are, of course, some tracks where it's really fun to have way too much reverb and delay, and it's like part of the signature sound of the track. But in those contexts, there will often be a really significantly treated reverb or delay that's especially EQ'd or messed up in some way or another to give it a real signature sound, so it almost becomes like another instrument in the mix. The next big common, I'd say, mix mistake that you can solve is way too much top end. We talked already about way too much low end, which is common on a lot of tracks I have to master, but way too much top end is a problem that usually will come from just one or two elements in the mix. Sometimes it'll be everything. There'll just be way too much top end in general compared to your references. And one of the great cures there, and this is a great cure for a lot of the stuff on this list, is checking references occasionally, especially earlier on in your career when you're starting out. Just occasionally checking in references to kind of tune you into how bright is bright enough, how dark is too dark, how loud can a vocal be. But often it won't be that there's a ton of things that are way too bright. You could even have a mix, and this is very common, a mix that's a little bit darker than it wants to end up in mastering, but there'll be one element or two elements, often cymbals or hi-hats, or a vocal that has way too much high frequency energy on it compared to everything else. And cymbals, especially on acoustic live recorded drum kits, are probably major offender number one when it comes to this in the mixes that need help in the high end. You'll have a mix that's fairly dark overall compared to a finished commercial master, but you'll have cymbals or hi-hats that are really, really bright. So when you make the whole mix a little bit brighter to sound more like the commercial tracks that these artists or producers or mixers love, you'll make the cymbals really, really bright, because everything was dark, but the cymbals were a little too bright. So now when you brighten everything up, now the cymbals are super annoyingly bright. And in mastering, we try to fix that with de-essers, dynamic EQs, maybe multiband compression, maybe just EQ targeted in a certain area. But the best way to avoid that is to make sure that the brightness on your cymbals works with the rest of the track. Because if I'm going to have to darken down those cymbals significantly, we're going to end up in mastering bringing up the brightness on everything except for that area where the cymbals are so dominant. So now your vocals aren't quite as articulate and clear as they could be. So it could be holding back other elements in the mix. Another big offender here is sibilant vocals, where you have a fairly dark mix, but the vocals are relatively bright. They might have a lot going on around 8K or 10K. And again, darkening that area is going to hold back other elements in the mix when it comes to mastering. So making sure that the high frequencies in your mix have an appropriate amount of top end compared to your whole mix. I hope that one's useful for you as well. Next big problem when it comes to mixing, and I'd say this isn't a big one, and that is vocal levels that are often a little lower than is appropriate for your genre. Some people will provide mixes where the vocal's a little bit too loud. That happens. But more often, I would say people err on the side, especially if they're the vocalists themselves, of making the vocal a little bit quieter than it really ought to be. And same thing with the snare drum. So this would be the last thing I'd say, that snare drums and vocals, particularly in the pop genre, that are a little quieter than your favorite commercially released tracks. There's things I can do to help with that in mastering, but I'd say that's one thing that you'd be surprised sometimes if you're a new mixer listening to your mixes next to some of your favorite commercially released tracks, just how dominant that snare drum and that vocal can be relative to what you might be inclined to do when you're still fairly new at mixing. So those are my big ones. Do you think there are any problems you often hear in mixes from newer mixers? Are there any big problems that you had that you feel like you've overcome and were a big leap forward to you? I'd love to hear you add to this list. You can do that in the comments down below if you're on the YouTube or Facebook video versions of this. If you are listening to the audio-only versions like on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, you can always email me at podcast@sonicscoop.com. I read every single email that comes in through there. And you can also ask questions through podcast@sonicscoop.com, as well as the comments down below. And I answer those when I can on the podcast. I hope this one was useful for you. If you want to go even deeper with me, there are 5 habits that literally every single great mixer who I've talked to, worked with, studied, interviewed, 5 habits that really all of them do. There's some of them who just do 4, but most of them do all 5. And I want to tell you what those 5 habits are. And I'm going to tell you in a workshop called The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers that you can get at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. If you're interested in going deeper into mastering, you can get a free workshop with me called Mastering 101. You can get that at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. That's sonicscoop.com/mastering101. If you're super serious about this stuff, I also have full-length courses. You can check out my full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs at mixingbreakthroughs.com and Mastering Demystified at masteringdemystified.com. Probably the most useful things I've ever done. Super affordable, come with a money-back guarantee. I think you're really going to enjoy them, so definitely check those out. Speaking of things you should check out, last but not least, our sponsors for this week, Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects out there. If you haven't tried them, you absolutely should. Check them out at soundtoys.com, where you can try out anything they make for free for 30 days. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.